Things have changed a lot in the past year or so. You've probably seen differences in everything you do. But this isn't the first time Canada's seen a pandemic or the world. Between 1918 and 1920, we went through the erroneously named Spanish flu. And that was a bad one. Spanish flu was erroneously named because of World War I. The many nations at war censored their media, but Spain, being a neutral nation, didn't. Therefore, they were giving numbers of people becoming sick from this particular influenza, even their monarch who had become ill. So many people believed it was something that was originating in Spain. The influenza changed many things of the way people lived at that time. Things such as church, moving pictures, gatherings, bars, pubs, they were all closed. Nobody could go there. Even the NHL had to cancel the Stanley Cup in 1919 as many members of the Montreal Canadiens and the Seattle Metropolitans had come ill with the flu. Joe Hall, a Montreal defenseman, was called by death. The plague seemed to pick people randomly. People like Claire and Vera. They were roommates, and they had actually been to lectures about this pandemic. One morning, Claire gets up for breakfast. She calls to her roommate Vera that she's going down to have breakfast and she'll be back shortly. She doesn't get an answer. She goes down, she's having her breakfast, and during that time decides she's going to go out and do a little bit of shopping. She decides to go up, grab her purse, and go out. During that time, she calls to her roommate again to let her know that she's going out. Still, no response. This time, Claire is kind of worried. She goes in and checks. The attending physician estimates that Vera had passed away at about 2 a.m. But the strange thing about it, her roommate, when she went to bed, had no symptoms whatsoever. It's always an amazement when you find a piece of history. But when you find a piece of history of your own family, you kind of wonder what this person might have been thinking or doing at that time. But when you actually find something that has their written word and they're telling you about their life and daily happenings, that is quite an achievement. And I'm here today with David Hooper.
Good morning, Joe.
What is it that you've discovered from your family history?
Well, during the COVID, I've been reading my great-grandfather's diaries. And I started by looking at his diaries for the period of the Spanish flu epidemic more than 100 years ago.
He has a long line of diaries. He has a number of diaries telling a fair amount of the family story, doesn't he?
Yes, he kept diaries. Well, he started, I think, when he was a teenager, but I couldn't find those ones. They've disappeared.
Yeah.
But I've got them from 1895 until he died in 1936.
And during the time of the pandemic, where was he living?
Well, he was living in Victoria. He'd moved there from Nova Scotia as a 21-year-old young man.
And he had a fair amount to say about the pandemic.
Yes, he did. Except it was just one of the things that he mentioned in the diary, because at that time World War I was coming to an end, and that was what was preoccupying everybody. And then this flu epidemic showed up, but the big thing going on was this huge, biggest war there'd ever been.
Friday, October 11th. Heavy rain during the night and this morning, owing to the pressure of work. I hustled into town a little early, trying hard to catch up. Very busy all day, and the West Coast is a day late too. Bad news today. 3 boats torpedoed with a big loss of life. Fortunately, the Allies are still advancing. Our influenza epidemic is still increasing. 175 cases reported in Victoria.
So prior to the end of World War I, they didn't really consider it a pandemic?
Pandemic's the word we use now, but they very quickly called it an epidemic. Within a week of it showing up in Victoria, he was talking about the flu epidemic.
And how did it affect his family?
Well, his family and his extended family, they were fortunate. Nobody died, but an awful lot of them became sick or even very sick. But he certainly mentions the effect on Victoria, a lot of the effects that we've seen in the current COVID epidemic. In fact, there's some things that are very similar.
Yeah. What are some of the similarities?
Well, they called it the ban. And he said, well, public gatherings were banned. Churches were closed. Theaters, cinemas, because there were movie cinemas by then. Schools were shut down. But people still went to work. They had to. There was no welfare. There was no prime minister paying you to stay home. So you went to work anyway. So they did some of the moves that we've seen to try to limit the spread of the virus. But on the other hand, they had to survive.
So it was kind of a catch-22.
Yeah.
You know, you have to work to survive, but if you go to work, you could be spreading a virus.
Yeah. Well, he had 3 children in school, so they were home. So
Yeah.
underfoot had to figure out, just like now, what do you do with your kids?
Yeah.
Entertain them, educate them, whatever you're trying to do. And he had 3 daughters who were young adults, one who just got married, that was my grandmother, and the other 2, they were off in Vancouver to college. Well, that shut down too, so they came home.
And I believe the health officer in Vancouver wasn't as strict as Victoria.
No, that's what I gather, and I've been looking at the newspapers too, just to cross-reference, and yeah, the Victoria health officer was quicker to put in restrictions and to try to lessen the spread. And Vancouver wasn't so quick, their health officer, so consequently there were more cases of influenza and more deaths. And there was controversy about masks, or when do you remove the van, or not.
So
it was just like now. There was this controversy, except there was no social media, there was no radio, there was no television. It wasn't in your face like it is now, and there wasn't everybody shouting on social media.
Oh yeah, I know. I've seen some of that. But it did affect where he worked. There were employees there too who were stricken.
Oh yes, that was the first mention that he made. Was he was in charge of the mail order department in the biggest department store in Victoria. It's called Spencer's. And there were 2 young women that were all working with him on the mail order department, and that's the mention is, boy, I had a tough day. Nobody showed up. They're both sick, and so I had to do all the work myself, and he was tired.
Yeah.
And then that was a Monday. And then by the Friday, I think one of them came back, and he was relieved because the work was still piling up. One of the interesting things he mentioned was he was double busy on the Thursday because he had to make up the order for the West Coast. That was the Princess Maquina that used to come into Port Alberni once a week. And so he was double busy because he had to be making up that order. But by the Friday of that same week, he starts saying, oh, it's an influenza epidemic, and there's 175 cases in Victoria. So it took off.
Yeah. And I believe it wasn't too much longer after that, the numbers actually started to increase again.
Yes, by 3 days later, there was 200 and something cases in Victoria. And that's when, after that first week, that's when the restrictions start. The ban that he called. They closed the schools, the cinemas, and public gatherings, and churches. In those days, many more people, church was a big activity. And so that was quite something, shutting the churches down.
Yeah. And that was when, that was October, I believe, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
this was in October,
Yeah.
only a
but-
month before the end of the First World War.
Yeah. And then just prior to the end of the war, there was a false ending, I believe.
Yeah, he reported this in his diary, and then I looked it up in the Victoria paper. And yeah, there was on November the 7th, there were rumors, because the war was winding down because the German army was in retreat. And there were negotiations going on, and there was a false report of an armistice. And he said the town just exploded. He said there was, even though there wasn't supposed to be gatherings, forget it. It was the end of 4 years of war. And so he said everybody was out in the street. There was impromptu parades. There were firecrackers. There were all kinds of things going on. And then late at night, they learned, nope, false alarm.
Oh, but I'm sure that probably was a start of another wave.
Yeah, we would call that a super spreader, I think, nowadays.
Yeah.
And then when the Armistice Day 4 days later, when it was the real end of the war, well, same thing. So we had two super spreader events. And then 1 month later, 6 weeks, you got Christmas holidays.
Yes.
More super spreaders. And that's probably why he reported in January of 1919, hey, wow, the flu is back, worse than ever.
January 11th, Saturday. A little chance for relaxation today with the West Coast out of the way. Taking in a few outings, running around, attending to small commissions. Still keeps mild, a little dull today. Nearly everyone is interested in the flu. Nurses are in urgent demand. The doctors are on the rush all the time. George seems to be quite all right again, and our family quite good.
I believe they had taken the ban off there just in November.
Yeah, they took the ban off in November 20th, and the kids went back to school. But something I hadn't noticed when I first looked at the diaries, I picked up on it last week, was they shut the schools in Victoria down again in December because the flu rate was going up in the schools. So the public health officer obviously was trying to slow the transmission by shutting the schools, and then knowing that the Christmas holidays were coming on, so there would be a real break for the kids as spreaders.
Oh, for sure. And then on the second wave, after that, it really caught on again, the pandemic. It really fired up again.
Yeah.
I believe a number of his family was ill.
Yes, it looked. He often didn't say, "Oh, George has the flu" or something like that, but it was obvious that he did. Oh, George is home. He's flat out. He's got a high temperature. That was my grandfather, and then various of his in-laws and family members were going down one after the other, and some were so seriously ill that they had nurses came to the house to look after them. And he said that he was reporting that there was a shortage of nurses, and the doctors are getting run off their feet. A lot of stuff that we've been hearing about during the current COVID thing.
And that's not something that you would commonly do, is go to a hospital or call a doctor if you're not well.
Well, if you were sick, you'd call a doctor, and doctors would do house calls if you were lucky, but they were swamped.
So, but he was in a financial situation where he could afford a doctor. Many people at that time, doctors were out of range. We didn't have the Medicare that we have today.
That's right. That was one of the biggest differences between then and now. That's right. There was no Dr. Bonnie Henry, provincial health officer. There was a provincial health officer, but there wasn't the means of mass communications that we have now. And there wasn't a medical system like we've got now, no health insurance. So it was quite you're right. If you were well off, you got looked after better than if you were in more precarious circumstances.
January 25th, Saturday. Rain and wind is the order of the day. Pretty quiet in town and very few mail orders. No special news either. The authorities are discussing the ban again. The influenza seemed worse than ever. All sorts of reports going around. The store was open late tonight, but it was pretty quiet. Heavy rain most of the time and cold too.
And how long does he mention this particular influenza continuing till?
Well, after January of 1919, I don't see much mention of it in his diaries for that year. I know that if you look up in some of the histories, they will say there was third and fourth waves and stuff like that, but it didn't, you know, he was writing mainly of his daily activities and his family, and I guess that it went off of the screen in 1919. There was, I did learn that there were several temporary hospitals around. You know, like there was a big army camp in Victoria because of the war, and there was a temporary hospital there. And he mentions that, and it's also mentioned in the newspaper.
Yeah. So he himself, I believe, wasn't too well at the time either.
No, he never said, "Oh, I've got the flu" or something like that. He just kept going to work. Which I think in nowadays, the big thing is if you're sick, stay home. That's the big thing you see on all the signs now. Well,
now it's
him and everybody else, they all went to work.
Yeah.
And there was no vaccine. There's the biggest difference. There was no vaccine, so the disease just ran its course. The virus when it finally ran out of victims to get sick, then it finished.
Then it finished. Yes. We're into the last minute. Is there anything else you'd like to add that I might have missed?
Well, for me, the most important thing I've been getting out of these diaries is I'm meeting a fellow I never knew. My great-grandfather died in 1936. I never knew anything about him. My great-grandmother, I certainly knew. As a small child, I knew her as a very elderly granny, going blind and then suffering from dementia. But here I'm meeting them as vibrant young people with little kids running around and visiting back and forth in the family. And then all these other great aunts and great uncles that I knew as elderly gentlemen and elderly ladies, I'm seeing them as little kids running around. I'm finding, for me, it's a real revelation, and I feel privileged and lucky to have found this.
During the time of this pandemic, doctors were hard pressed, and they put the call out to people to come and help. Many people did. People like Mrs. Stevenson, a midwife in Nanaimo. She took up the challenge. But she had one secret before she would go into anybody's place. She had a bottle of brandy with her, even though she was a teetotaler. And what she would do, she'd take her bottle of brandy and she would get a little bit, wipe her mouth, wipe her nose, and wipe her hands before and after coming into anybody's place or leaving it. During the entire pandemic, for all the people that she saw, she never took sick. Remember, during this time, there's very few vaccines available. Even penicillin won't be discovered until 1928. Which is almost another 10 years away. So of course people are trying to find their own cures. Things such as goose grease, bran, lard, mixed with turpentine to rub on your chest or other body parts. There was Dr. Williams' pink pills for pale people. Of course, that only lasted a while as it was found out to be an actual scam. As you can see, some things never change. People are people. This particular pandemic is finally starting to clear up, just like it did in 1920. But remember, always use the safety precautions that your medical professional has advised. I'm Gerald LeBute, your friendly neighborhood time traveler, and I'll see you next time, whenever in time that may be. And remember, please stay safe.